Before we get started, we can just start with some introduction. So my name is Eva. I'm from the partnerships team at Ark Curriculum Plus. So I work with new schools or trusts that are looking to join our program, or with existing partner schools and trusts, and making sure that everything is okay with their account. I come from a teaching background, but I'm science, not English. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Michlyn.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us, especially on a hot day where I assume you probably want to be sitting out in your garden enjoying the sunshine. But if you're here today, you're here to listen and think about reading. My name is Michlyn. I am the head of English secondary, English mastery, Ark Curriculum Plus, and it's my pleasure today just to share some of the thinking behind our Reading for Pleasure spine. So I'm just going to quickly go through the agenda so you know exactly what we're covering in this session. I'm just going to quickly introduce who we are, what right have we to talk about reading. I'm then going to outline ARC's approach to reading, talk about our principles for reading for pleasure, some possible proxies for reading for pleasure, and then thinking about how to implement your strategy for reading for pleasure. So who are we? Well, we are English Mastery and we are Ark Curriculum Plus. And basically we've grown out of Ark, which is one of the highest performing multi-academy trusts in the UK. We have 39 schools in and around Birmingham, London, Hastings and Portsmouth. And English Mastery is part of the Ark Curriculum Plus partnership. So we also offer other subjects and other programmes. But I'm pleased to say that our programmes are now used by sort of over 600 schools and 15 multi-academy trusts in the country. And we launched in 2014. And in 2014, we had a clear focus on designing and launching an English curriculum with integrated assessment framework and embedded CPD as well to offer successful implementation. So in short, my team and I work really closely with schools within ARC, but also other multi-academy trusts in terms of implementing a really robust English curriculum. And so that's who we are. And ultimately, this is our mission. I'll just give you a moment to read that on the screen. And so as a non-profit organisation, children and young people really are at the centre of what we do. And our team of curriculum designers and expert trainers are all former teachers who, like you, want to ensure success in English for all students, regardless of their starting places. So why are we talking about reading? Well, we're actually in a bit of a reading paradox at the moment because teaching of reading has actually improved. So England's students are actually excelling in reading, ranking 4th globally in attainment according to the Progress in International Reading Literacy Study. But there is a concerning gap because only 29% say they enjoy reading compared to an international average of around 50%. And perhaps even more striking is that nearly 1 in 4 openly admit that they don't like reading at all. And therefore the paradox is that you've actually got high scores in reading, but there's very low enthusiasm and there's low enjoyment in reading. And a recent National Literacy Trust study into reading enjoyment found that around 2 in 5 of those between the age of 8 and 18 said that they enjoyed reading in their free time during the previous year. And the age range that showed the least enjoyment in reading as a pastime were actually those between 11 to 14. And that was 40.4%, suggesting that Key Stage 3 teachers face the biggest challenge in promoting recreational reading practices, which probably isn't surprising. My daughter's in year 7, and I found even though she was a really avid reader at primary school, now that she's started year 7, that enjoyment in reading has really dropped. And so we're in a bit of a crisis also. That really affects our subject because we already know that at A level, for example, the sign-ups for A level literature are really, really low. And perhaps engagement in reading is really something to do with that. And perhaps exacerbating the issue is that many school libraries are suffering from chronic underfunding and in far too many cases have been shut down entirely. So I know many schools who don't even have their own librarian anymore, or libraries have been turned into ICT rooms or classrooms rather than actually having a place for students to find some wonderful books to read. And so this leaves teachers without access to both the physical resources and the specialised expertise that libraries provide in fostering a culture for reading for pleasure. And therefore, without a well-structured strategy to promote reading for enjoyment, students really risk missing out on the lifelong cognitive and emotional and academic benefits that reading can offer. Now, you've probably been keeping up with what's happening, with the curriculum assessment review, but in case you missed it, the DfE also recently released a document and some supporting videos in terms of supporting reading in secondary school. If you haven't seen that, I'd really recommend watching them and accessing them. They're free to all schools. The leadership videos really provide a good overview of key areas of reading theory and assessment. And the teacher videos also go through some really solid strategies for example, choosing texts, identifying features of disciplinary text, vocabulary and comprehension. And there are questions threaded throughout the videos and the documents that provided to help you think about where you are now and where you want to focus your priorities moving forward. Now, I don't think anyone's really going to give a full strategy for schools because every school is different. What this guidance is meant to give you, and also some of the things that I'll be going through in this webinar, is we're not going to give you a fully realised reading strategy, but we are going to give you some sort of best bits and outline best practice in terms of getting something coherent together for your colleagues or for reviewing what you're already doing. So for example, how are you reading in English? How does that translate to the rest of the school? What texts are we currently reading in classrooms? What approaches do we need to be able to model in our classrooms? And we're thinking of a higher level perspective of how do we put that strategy together and really meet the needs of your school context. So I'm just going to share Ark's approach to reading and how we've attacked reading within the Ark Multi-Academy Trust, what materials we provide to our teachers, and then I'm going to sort of go to wider sort of thinking about how to think about putting your own strategy together. So in Ark, we really clearly specify to teachers what and why of teaching. So what reading means and why it's really important. So for us, reading is a source of knowledge and agency, and we think it's so important because we think that all children should have equitable access to the benefits and pleasure of being able to read well. We know that the opportunities that provides in their lives are all connected. So therefore, children who attend Ark schools should expect to be able to read at or above their chronological age, because we believe that this is their entitlement and also our responsibility to make sure that that is the case when they leave us. And therefore, our aims within Ark is to rapidly close the provision gap to enable all pupils to read at or above their chronological age, but also to be able to build teacher and leader expertise in reading across our schools. And therefore, we want to make sure that we deploy interventions which really work and also rapidly improve reading. And lastly, we want to make sure that we can support all pupils to access well-chosen and engaging texts, and therefore establish a really robust culture which places reading at the heart of the provision. And I think it's that last bullet point that can be quite tricky. How do we do that? What things do we need to have in place in order to build that really strong culture? So within Ark, I'm just giving you a screenshot here. We have our own toolkit that leaders are able to access. And so within Ark, one of the first things that we really do is make sure that we have an accurate diagnosis of need. So although this webinar is focusing on, in particular, reading for pleasure, I just wanted to highlight some of the other things that happened before that. I mean, before we start reading for pleasure, we are also looking at making sure that students are at their reading age, and how do we close those gaps if they're not. So here is just an example of the toolkit that we provide our teachers. So we have various foundational expectations. So for example, we make sure that students have an annual NGRT test, that we are really clear in terms of the steps of how to diagnose needs of students. So we have a really clear flow chart, an intervention flow chart telling us, if a student is below, what are the next steps to follow? And then within that toolkit, we also have all of the interventions that we suggest for pupils who are below their current reading age. We also have details of the phonics programs that we use, and also then the various interventions that can be led by trained adults. So you'll see at the bottom there that we've got a guide for our primary schools and also a guide for our secondary schools. So it's all connected. We're not just thinking that reading for pleasure on its own is going to solve all of the problems with reading. We know that there are separate things that we need to look at. But I just wanted to show you kind of a holistic view of how we approach reading in ARK. And one of the aims that I discussed earlier was about developing practice and expertise. So you can see here, all of these things are covered by our trust. So first and foremost is that reading fluency and comprehension. But what I'm going to be talking about in this webinar really is more focused on reading for pleasure. So you might already have some really strong strategies on how to close gaps for reading ages, reading fluency, etc. This webinar really is going to be focusing on reading for pleasure. And some of the strategies that I'm going to be talking about today actually came from our working party in the Art Network for Reading for Pleasure. So that's what I want to share with you today in terms of some of those things that came out of that working party. So what do we think reading for pleasure means? Well, we synthesized all of the work that we did in our research reviews and also feedback from our working party and came up with this definition. So I'm just going to share a couple of things and give you a moment just to read what is on the screen there. So I've just put the sources there as well in case you want to note them down. And so for us, ultimately, we think reading for pleasure really, what's central to reading for pleasure is student choice and agency. That's what's going to be central to the success of any reading for pleasure strategies. And we thought that this was really important to first of all define as a network, what do we actually mean by reading for pleasure? And this is what we came up with. So student choice and agency. And after defining that really clearly, we then came up with our principles for reading for pleasure. So these are the 3 principles that we came up with. So, and I'll go through each one in a bit more detail for you. So first of all, is about students, knowing your students. Secondly, is about building your community. And thirdly, out of that, planning your strategy. So in terms of knowing your students, we think that finding out about the interests of your students is probably the first step in creating a positive culture around reading for pleasure. Because when students are exposed to texts that reflect their hobbies and interests, they're probably going to be more likely to pick them up and keep reading. And also linking reading to something that students already enjoy helps shift their perception of reading from academic to enjoyable. So starting with familiar interests can be a gateway to broader reading. For example, a student who loves graphic novels about superheroes might later explore mythology, history, or science fiction. And it's really important that students are given the agency to choose their own text, to develop their reader identity, and to see themselves as a reader. Again, I'll use my daughter as an example. I think lots of schools are either using Accelerated Reader or Sparks Reader, which is absolutely fine. But I think sometimes using some of those programs, you've got to make sure that the texts that are available on those programs actually appeal to your students. Because my daughter, for example, found that there just wasn't enough types of text that she would have enjoyed reading, and it can be quite limiting. And so that, that's another kind of barrier of students accessing reading because they just feel like the texts aren't there for them. And so it's really important, once you've thought about your reading fluency, obviously that is really important, but after you know that students are fluent in reading, is then thinking about, okay, how do we then give students the agency to choose their own text and to develop their reader identity? And one of the ways to do that is also to think about building your community. So once you've thought about your students, the type of, the context of students in your particular school or a particular year group, talking to lots of different people and also students themselves. I think sometimes when we build a strategy for something like reading, we don't often have a panel for students to voice their opinions. And so having student panels, really asking them what their interests are, what type of books they like to read, I think is really important to know that first before then thinking about putting your strategy together. So then the second thing that we talked about is knowing your community. So knowing what excites your students allows you to recommend books they're more likely to connect with and build trust and enthusiasm around reading. However, it can be perhaps challenging to teachers who perhaps, teaching on a regular basis is takes up enough of your time. So then having to keep up with the most up-to-date text for young people also takes up a lot of time. So one powerful way to promote reading for pleasure is actually by cultivating what we call a reading community. So that could be within a single school or perhaps across a multi-academy trust, or even regionally if you're able to have access to other schools within that hub. And these communities really create a shared culture where reading is celebrated, supported, and sustained. So you might, for example, have a reading community where adults are modeling reading behaviors and reading experiences. And we know this already happens in schools. We know, for example, in lots of schools that I've visited, you have lots of teachers have on their classroom door saying which books they're reading, or perhaps if they have a book event, you might have pictures of teachers reading a book, a particular book they enjoy, and kind of recommending that. But it's deeper than that. It's also thinking about how do you model good reading behaviors rather than just recommending a book. Where else can our students see us modeling good reading? And the other thing that we thought about is just thinking about how do you widen the pool of knowledge to each member of the community? So for example, collaborative planning might be able to take place for events like World Book Day or National Poetry Day or themed reading weeks, or making reading visible and exciting across the school calendar. So how do you, thinking about how do you make reading visible? How do you make it exciting across the school calendar? Is it just one event per year, or is it part of your daily practice? And what does that look like? And how are your adults in your school able to model that good practice? But another thing that we also encourage is professional dialogue. So where can staff exchange ideas, or where can staff seek advice on engaging reluctant readers or explore new texts or, teaching strategies? So if your school has a librarian, for example, they absolutely, and I know that unfortunately so for some schools, you're not having the funding for that anymore, but if you do have access to a school librarian, thinking about making them the heart of your reading community. So as specialists in children and young adult literature, librarians really are an invaluable resource and really should be the first point of contact for book recommendations, reading trends, and also advice on engaging readers. I spoke to a librarian in a school that I support recently, and she had some really great insights just in terms of, for example, we were looking at The Tempest and we were looking at colonization, and she was able to say to me, well, actually, these students come into this library because they've learnt this in English, they're asking about this particular topic in other subjects. So they're really great also in terms of thinking about what knowledge do they have in terms of the rest of the school and other subjects, not just English. What do they know about current fiction? What books can they recommend? And if you know that there are specific texts that you study in English or any other subject, they'll be able to suggest, a kind of almost like another reading list that might support or pique students' interest if they're interested in a particular topic or subject. So that's about building community. Once you've built your community, you've then got to really think about your strategy, and this is going to take time. So reading for pleasure requires commitment and long-term planning to succeed. It's not going to solve itself just by deciding to have reading for pleasure event once a year, or perhaps having reading time during tutor time. So what we really suggest is that schools should take a research-informed approach to reading for pleasure as part of any whole school improvement plan, with the awareness that reading for pleasure is hard to quantify because it involves deeply personal, emotional, and often invisible experiences that don't easily translate into measurable data. So that's the first hurdle, is remembering that actually it can be quite difficult sometimes to measure the impact of any strategy that you put into place. But as a first step, you might want to consider the following questions that we derived from the Educational Endowment Foundation in terms of from their guide to implementation. So these questions are, first of all, whatever strategy you want to put into place for reading for pleasure, why are you doing it? So what is the issue that you're trying to address with your reading for pleasure strategy? Then secondly, what exactly are you looking to introduce? So what are the active ingredients? And I'll speak to that about that a little bit more detail later. But what are the active ingredients of a reading for pleasure approach? And then thirdly, how are you going to do it? So what activities and strategies are you going to use to implement your strategy? And then thinking about the impact part. So, how well is the process going? What are the stepping stones towards the final outcomes? And how are you going to know that you're making progress in the implementation of reading for pleasure towards a final outcome? And lastly, so what? What are the final outcomes and objectives? How will the school, teachers, and students benefit from the short-term, mid-term, and long-term implementation of the reading for pleasure strategy? What change behaviours are you expecting to see after you implement your strategy? And it's really useful to have a clear strategy because then that also outlines your steps into where you are. I think first of all you need to figure out, where are we as a school, what is it that we want to change, and how we're going to get there. And the reason why it is good to have a strategy is because often you might have a reading lead, or someone, whoever's in charge of reading, might say, oh, readers aren't, students just aren't reading, they're not enjoying reading, so let's have these, here are some solutions. But actually, sometimes some of these solutions can be what we call poor proxies. So I'm just going to give you a minute just to look at that list on the screen there. Some of those things you might be able to put a tick beside that your schools are already using. Now, I'm not saying these are bad things at all, but I do want to take a couple of them in a moment and explain why they might be poor proxies for reading for pleasure. And then I'll talk a bit more about how to think about your plan. So you might see a couple in there that you'll be able to relate to. So I'm going to give you a scenario of a school. This is school A. School A has a policy of assigning detentions to students who forget to carry their reading book. So it's mandated that students should have a reading book on them at all times. And the justification for this approach is that it serves as a reminder of the school's commitment to fostering responsible behaviour and a culture of reading. So as a result of this policy, teachers have noticed that more students have a reading book on them. So I'm just going to give us a moment. You don't have to put in the chat, but you might just want to reflect to yourself. What are the possible pros and cons of this reading for pleasure scenario? Because this is a real scenario. This is I see some schools using this, and I'm just going to, then I'll talk you through how that relates to what we've suggested in terms of our principles, in terms of knowing students, building community, and then planning your strategy.
So we've got a con in the chat saying that it doesn't necessarily mean the book is being read.
Yeah, great, thank you. Feel free to put things in the chat, by the way. We don't want to put you on the spot, but if you are willing to share, it's absolutely great.
Pro is it encourages all to choose books.
Yeah, absolutely.
A con is that reading is weaponized and it potentially becomes associated with sanctions rather than pleasure. Another con is that there's a negative attachment with the detention.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing, right? It's that weaponizing of reading. I think sometimes that reading for pleasure is really difficult because we know that reading is really important. We know that there's a decline, and therefore we put so many strategies in place to try and encourage reading, but actually it kind of does the exact opposite. It's not pleasurable at all. So yes, definitely those comments I agree with. So here are, first of all, there are pros, and I've just tried to split it in terms of those three principles. So the pro is, well, in terms of students, that means that they have reading books on them, and presumably time is made available for reading. So possibly they'll have time during form time, or if there's some time at break time, because they've got a book on them, there's time for reading. In terms of community, well, they're attempting to create a culture of reading by ensuring they have a book. And the strategy is to improve reading for pleasure, but the importance really is placed on having a book, and that's they're making that part of their school policy. They're trying to make that consistent. But yes, the cons. Yeah, absolutely. We don't know if students are fluent in reading. They might have just grabbed a book to avoid a detention. I know in a school that I worked at where this was policy, often that was the case. And if, they came into form time as a tutor and they'd be like, Miss, I haven't got a reading book. Can I borrow a reading book? Because they didn't want to get detention, rather than actually reading the book itself. If I stopped any student and asked them, oh, what are you reading? Tell me about your book. A lot of the time they weren't able to. Community really isn't, I don't think it is building a culture, because they're using sanctions to promote reading, and like somebody said in the chat earlier, it's being weaponized. Reading's weaponized. It's a sanction rather than being something that they want to do voluntarily and that they enjoy. And if we were to look at any research, there's not any research to say that this is a research-informed strategy. So we couldn't really define it as a research-informed strategy. It's just perhaps somebody, somebody in the leadership team has thought this might work, but there's no kind of research to suggest that it or evidence that it will work. Okay, another scenario, another popular strategy, and this is School B. So School B has a dear time or drop everything and read policy. So every lesson after lunch, the first 10 minutes is used for silent reading. I've also seen it in schools where 10 minutes of every lesson is used for silent reading. Students are meant to bring along their own books for this time, although this doesn't always happen. And it's been suggested that teachers model good reading to the students during this time, but SLT has noticed that this isn't happening. So again, if you have got some time and you're willing to in the chat, please feel free to put the pros and cons of this strategy. So drop everything and read.
Got a pro that this establishes reading as a core part of the learning day.
Yep.
A con is that students are often not actively reading during this time. Instead, they're staring at the pages but not actually reading.
Yeah, that is a good one. They're just being silent, right?
Yeah.
Not actually reading. Okay, right. So I'm going to run through the pros and cons of this one. So yeah, it's definitely good at promoting habits, minimizing disruptions. Perhaps it creates a calmer start to lessons, especially if behavior is a bit of a something that you're trying to improve in the school. So yes, it can kind of create those habits initially. Community, well, they're attempting to create a culture of reading by allowing over a set, like reading to happen over a set time. So they've got set time. I think somebody mentioned that in the chat. And their strategy is to improve reading for pleasure, again, by building consistency across the school in terms of the requirement to read for pleasure. But in terms of cons, well, if they're lacking books, it perhaps indicates that there's limited access or interest in reading. Perhaps a lack of discussion as well. If it's silent, teachers can't really have those meaningful discussions about the book itself that they're reading or reading habits. At the start of a lesson, teachers have distractions and priorities, making it challenging to model good reading behaviours. And again, it's not a research-informed strategy. So again, it's perhaps great to kind of encourage it at first, but long term, is it going to have the impact that you want? Possibly not. So that was just in terms of proxies, I just wanted to highlight two really popular strategies that schools are putting into place and highlight it may initially build some good habits and it may initially be able to try and build some consistency, but it's thinking about the long term. How do we get impact from it in the long term? And that really comes down to the strategy that you put into place. Now, one of the things that you'll want to think about when putting your strategy together is your theory of change. And your theory of change includes the following things. First of all, is identifying the need. Why is intervention needed? Why is reading for pleasure a key thing that your school really needs to focus on? If you're a leader in a school, what is it impacting? If you didn't have an intervention for reading for pleasure, what would the alternative be? What other things is it going to impact? Then you need to think about your participants. So who is the intervention for? Is it a specific, is it going to be a pilot program and you're just targeting a specific group of students? or is it going to go whole school? And what are the characteristics of those who are going to be taking part in this strategy, or this, whatever you're going to be implementing, the intervention? And then you need to think about the intervention itself, like how is it going to work? What are the logistics of it? What will the participants of this intervention actually do? How much time of the school day is it going to take? And that includes the, teachers and the leaders who are going to be leading the intervention, as well as the students who are going to be taking part. And then lastly is thinking about the outcome. What is the primary outcome for the children? Why is it important to development? And that kind of links to the mission that I shared at the beginning of this webinar. What our mission is as a program, but also Ark's mission and Ark's specific mission in terms of reading for pleasure. So those are the things that you're going to really need to be clear on for your theory of change. And so that brings me on to the implementation cycle. If you're a school leader, you're probably seen this several times, and that's absolutely fine, because it really is a good framework to start in terms of checking where you are in terms of your implementation journey for reading for pleasure. So it might be that you are in the explore stage and you haven't got any strategies in place whatsoever, but you're starting to identify that perhaps it is a priority for your school, and that perhaps systematically it's something that you need to focus on and change. Or you might be in the prepare phase where you've already done your exploration, you've already done lots of research, and now what you're trying to do is put into place your plan. Starting to develop a clear, logical plan and assessing whether or not the school are ready to deliver your plan. Or it might be that you're in the deliver stage where you've already got a plan, you're already using, you've already started some key stages of the plan, and perhaps you're maybe even halfway through. Or it could be in sustain, where you've already actually implemented a strategy and now you're scaling up and you're thinking about the next stage. So just out of interest, in the chat, if you don't mind, I'd just like you to think, what stage do you think your school are at in terms of implementing reading for pleasure as a strategy for your school? For some of you, this just coming to this webinar might be part of your explore phase, and that's absolutely fine. You want to be able to see what's out there. Okay, so just have a think about where you're at, because depending on where you're at in this cycle is, hopefully I'll be able to give you some things to think about after this webinar, so that you know, okay, what are the next steps. So if you are in the explore phase of the cycle, then you've identified reading for pleasure as something that you need to change, and you're now perhaps looking at programs or practices to implement. So if you are in this phase, and that's probably why you're at this webinar, you're looking at what programs exist out there and how do they fit, and how, are they feasible within our school context. So it might be that again, you could be using external programs like Accelerated Reader or Sparks, or any other reading programs. And I'm not talking, now this could be reading programs to help students move up to meet their current reading age. So you might be looking at fluency, you might be just making sure that you're closing gaps in terms of reading age, but you might also be exploring programs in terms of reading for pleasure. So now hopefully you're kind of looking at all of your options. But one thing that I would suggest is making sure that whatever program that you're looking at, that it really fits within your context. And some of the questions that you might want to ask yourself, that I'll show you a bit later, is really crucial, because you need to think about how much time is it going to take to implement this, and ultimately what is the outcome that we really want from using this program or implementing this strategy. So if you're in the prepare stage, like I said, you're going to be thinking about your plan. So again, I'm going to give you some an example and some of the free resources that we will provide after this webinar will start getting you to think about some of those questions that you need to ask yourself to prepare for that plan. So you also need to be thinking about practical plans, for example, training staff, developing the actual infrastructure within your school to ensure that teachers have got the time, but also the training to be able to lead whatever it is, whatever strategy that you're trying to implement. And also, if you're then in the deliver phase, you need to be thinking about how do you support staff and solve problems using a flexible leadership approach. How are you going to reinforce initial training with follow-up or support within the school? And how are you going to use your data, whatever data you gather in that first stage, to see if your strategy is having impact? How are you going to use that data to further drive faithful adoption or intelligent adaptation? So one of the things that we did in Ark was to really summarize for us, what would we want to see in schools? So if we're saying that we want a love of reading in all art schools, what does that actually look like? Tangibly concrete things that we can see in schools to say, yes, there is definitely a love of reading here. So I'm just going to share these with you. So we decided that actually one element that we think shows love of reading is that teachers read regularly to pupils, and they provide excellent models because they have all themselves received strong professional development in that area. Secondly, there is a systemized approach to the books which are selected by teachers to read aloud to pupils across the school. So you might already have reading for pleasure time, for example, once a week or once a fortnight, but is there an actual approach to how those books are selected? Or is it just because we've gone into the English cupboard, we've seen which books aren't being taught in a Key Stage 3 curriculum anymore, we don't want to spend any money, therefore they are the books that students are reading. Rather than that, can you think of an actual systemized approach? What is a clear rationale which then forms part of the wider English or reading curriculum? The third thing is that the English curriculum clearly outlines how the reading spine is progressive and fulfills the aims of the national curriculum. So we wanted that love of reading not just to be something separate, reading for pleasure, but also included in our English curriculum. And then we said that actually that we want to make sure that there are a wide range of non-fiction books which are clearly matched to national curriculum subjects and topics that pupils' reading ages can read as part of their regular reading diet. So this forms an essential part of their background knowledge, and this is monitored and evaluated. So we've said that actually it should be part of the English curriculum, but also we're saying, in national curriculum subjects, we want to make sure that there's also non-fiction support there, and that's part of students' regular reading diet, not just reading novels. We want non-fiction there as well. And then number 5 was that we want to make sure that there's regular sessions scheduled in for pupils to visit the library and also select books which support their wider learning. So what does that look like? Is that happening in English lessons, or does that happen during form time? What are those regular sessions? Where are they timetabled? What are those opportunities? Then we wanted to make sure that there's a real system in place to track and monitor pupils through library loans. Lexia, for example, should be shared with the reading lead, form tutors, and they're able to act on any concerns that arises from those systems. And I mentioned pupil voice earlier. We think that is really important. So having opportunity for pupil voice, making sure that pupil voice activities feed into the evaluation of reading, that's really important to us. And also making sure there's a really clear approach to supporting parents in supporting their children at home, reading at home, particularly for those who are below their current reading age. And lastly, which, funnily enough, I think number 9 is what schools focus on the most, is how do we promote reading in a variety of ways and not perhaps consider some of the other things that are really crucial that come before that. But yes, ultimately making sure the school promotes reading in a variety of ways. And so by Ark creating this summary of our love reading, if we're saying that we would want, if we had a magic wand, we would want all of art schools to be showing all 9 of these things. That's what we decided. Then that's what we came up with from our working party. So then we had to consider, okay, how do we use this summary to now almost provide an audit, or think about the active ingredients that we really want to put into place to make sure these things happen. So this is what it looks like in terms of identifying an active ingredient. So an active ingredient, if you don't know, is what are the concrete actions that you can put into place to make sure that what you've identified actually happens. So if we take number 1 as an example, we said that teachers read regularly to pupils and provide excellent models because they have received strong PD in this area. So the ingredients we identified then, well, actually, how do we support that? Well, first of all, we need to build slots into weekly timetables for teachers to read aloud high quality text to pupils. So that might be in English lessons or that might be in form time, but we need to identify where those regular slots are going to be in the timetable. Then secondly, we need to make sure that our staff have training. So how do you read aloud well? English teachers might be really confident in reading aloud, but is that the same for your geography teachers or your science teachers or maths teachers? We need to make sure that we're giving all staff that high quality training. And then thirdly, we need to make sure that the reading leads, so just to let you know, in Ark, we have reading leads in all of our schools. So that is a TLR. So here we're saying that actually those members of staff who have got a TLR for reading, they're the ones who provide guidance to all staff in terms of expectations for how to use staff fluency, prosody, and checking for understanding, for example, in these lessons. So we're going to use the reading leads as a resource to help provide guidance to other staff in the school. And then we're also going to want to ensure that staff have pre-read content to be read to pupils prior to the lesson so that teachers are familiar with the content. So if we're expecting teachers to read regularly to pupils and we're expecting them to be strong models, A, we've got to give them the time and the training, and B, we've got to make sure that we give them the content. It's not just, for example, oh, we're rolling out reading on Monday, period 1 or form time. Here are the slides, off you go. We want to make sure that they have access to that content way in advance, so that they're familiar, they've had practice with it, and they're able to model that really clearly. And so then we've got to think about, okay, what are the other things that we've got to put in place to make sure that all those 3 things happen? And you can see that here. So we've thought about the professional development. We thought about the reading lead, I already mentioned. Then we've also thought about class reading time. So how is that going to be timetabled without any interruptions, making sure that it actually happens rather than a nice to have. How are we making sure that teachers are able to read aloud and with pace, tone, volume to really engage students. Then we need to think about our text choices. Are they varied enough? Are they challenging enough? Do they include a range of fiction and non-fiction? Do teachers know the text that they're reading? Do teachers have the mechanism to know their students' reading ages? How is that going to be shared with teachers to support pathways and strategies available? How do teachers use class reading time to support pupils? So listening to them read, for example, discussing text with groups. So it's really important that that's why I've kind of done it, showed you step by step. Once you've decided what phase you're on your implementation, then you've summarized what do you really want to have in terms of your love of reading, what does that look like? Then you will have to break each one down and really think about, okay, what are the ingredients? What do we want? What are the things we have to put into place? And you might want to do that for all 9 or however many you have in your strategy. So then that moves me on to, well, how do we support you? How do we do that in English Mastery? How does our curriculum do that? So in English Mastery, in our curriculum that Ark schools use in Key Stage 3, we suggest that reading for pleasure happens at least once a fortnight. So that is timetabled into Key Stage 3 curriculum time. However, we also provide lots of guidance for school leaders like yourselves. If you're a school leader or a reading lead or head of department, we give you all of the documentation to help you with your intent and implementation. So I've just taken a screenshot here of our learning platform called My Mastery, and you'll see here actually all of the documents that we have to support you as leaders. So when a school joins us and starts using our curriculum for the first time, these are some of the documents that we share with them. So if reading for pleasure is a real focus for them, then we will share all these documents. So we'll have things like, okay, here are the questions that you as a middle leader, if you're a Key Stage 3 lead, or a head of department need to be asking yourselves. But also, if you're a senior leader, SLT, or reading is a special project for you as a senior leader, here are some of the things that you need to look at. And then we've also summarized all of the key research. So some of the poor proxies that we looked at earlier, those scenarios, we said that actually some of them weren't research informed. Well, we've actually summarized all of the key research in one document for you to look at, so that you can kind of spend some time really exploring those. And then we help you write your actual intent for reading for pleasure. What is it that you want reading to be like? What's your, for you, what are your principles for reading for pleasure? We also have some tips in terms of how to choose text, so selection criteria and top tips. And we've worked really closely with librarians in the Art Network for that. So we've even created, for example, reading lists that will, I'll just see. We've created reading lists, you'll see on the left-hand side there, and they are organised by genre. They're already got links to Accelerated Reader as well, if you use Accelerated Reader. And what we've also done is for our key texts that we teach in the curriculum, so for example, Oliver Twist in Year 7, we also have a suggested reading list that might be linked to that text. So for example, in Oliver Twist, we know that there's Oliver's an orphan, and so we've also suggested some texts where perhaps key characters are orphans, or it might be some text that's set in the Victorian period and that kind of thing. So we've got some really robust reading lists there. And then the other thing that we have in our guidance is links to the Ofsted Curriculum Research Review for Reading for Pleasure, the Reading Framework, and other useful links, and also just the national curriculum. So all of those things we have within our program. We work really closely with school leaders. For example, there have been times when they said, can you have a look, can you have a chat with our librarian, can you talk to our librarian and our reading lead in terms of how we can really boost reading for pleasure? How does it work in ARC? So we work with them closely as well. We don't just provide the documents, we give all of those things as well. So I'm going to pause there. We've got a little bit of time, so I'm happy if there's anyone that has any specific questions to put them in the chat. And we can do a quick Q&A if there are questions.
We had a school earlier who mentioned that they'd tried the school B strategy, and they said that they'd tried that strategy for a year and they had some success but nothing life-changing. So there was some further comments on the previous bit as well.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, I mean, please don't feel like any of the strategies that I've mentioned today don't work at all. I think I just wanted to highlight, if you are using these strategies, to have a really clear idea of what you want the outcome to be and how is that going to translate long term. So I think doing the initial work of identifying what do you mean by reading for pleasure? What do we mean by love for reading here at our specific school? I think that work is really important. And I think that's one thing to take away from the webinar, is that although I'm sharing what's happening, what's working in ARC, you've got to do your own research. And even some of the stuff that have been released by the DFE, it really does, some of the questions that are in there are making you think about your specific context. Because I think, if we think about the principles of knowing your students, students that are in an inner London school is going to be different perhaps from a coastal school in Devon, for example. So you've got to really think about what's going to work for your students, rather than just copy and pasting a strategy from one school where it's worked.
We have a two-part question. So it's what makes a strong reading lesson and what is included specifically in the ARC reading lessons?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I think it's really important that, and this is what's really important as well, is communicating to school leaders, is that reading for pleasure lessons are very different from other English lessons, right? In a literature lesson, of course, you're going to expect to see some really deep analysis. And I think sometimes the mistake is that reading for pleasure lessons just becomes another English lesson. So I think that's one thing to make sure that actually really clarify how different reading for pleasure is going to be, because really what we promote in an ARC reading for pleasure lesson is enjoyment. And so there's not going to be lots of writing, there's not going to be lots of actually a lot of the time is discussion. So in some of the templates, and I'm sorry I haven't shared them here, but we do provide a template lesson. One thing that we do look at though is explicit teaching of vocabulary, especially if it's linked to the bit of reading that's going to be covered in that lesson. So we do allow, whether that's at the beginning of the lesson or somewhere in the middle, we do think that explicit teaching of vocabulary is really important, especially if there's tier 2 or tier 3 vocabulary in there. And then the rest of the time really is just guided questions. It's thinking about what are the key themes, you know, what has a teacher planned the guided questions that you're going to ask in that reading lesson. It's having time for the teacher to model really good reading, but also then, you know, building the confidence of students to be able to read in a lesson as well. I think that's what's really important. And therefore, you know, if you have got a member of SLT coming in and they're observing a reading for pleasure lesson, I think it's good for them to understand it is going to be different from a typical English lesson. They're not going to be doing much writing. It really is about fostering the joy of what's happening in the text. You'll find that really good reading for pleasure lessons, especially if they happen before lunchtime, students don't want to go to lunch because they want to carry on reading the book. They want to find out what happens next. So if that's happening, you know that's a good lesson because you've already gone past that first hurdle of engaging students. But yeah, if you go on to some of our trial resources, I think we do have a reading for pleasure lesson there, so you can have a look at some of the slides if you wanted some more detail on that. Great. Okay. So what we are, sorry, let me just go into the next slide. English Mastery is using Ark, and it's using other multi-academy trusts as well and other schools. If you have joined this call, if you're signed up for this webinar, what you will get is a free resource that might help you in the first stage of planning for reading for pleasure. But you can also reach out to us, which has got you've got the email address on here. You can also book in to have a chat with a member of the team directly. I think we might put a link in the chat. So please feel free to do that. And there will be a follow-up email.
Yeah,
as well.
I'll be emailing everyone who's attended with a recording, just so if you want to share it with colleagues or anything like that, you're able to do that. And in the follow-up email, I'll also include a link if you would like to book in to chat a bit more about what English Mastery specifically contains that could potentially be in your school.
Yeah, so hopefully that was useful. Hopefully at least you're able to come away with, okay, what steps are where are we at in terms of implementing our strategy? Have we summarized what we really want to see in terms of love for reading, like the 9 sort of ARC love for reading things that we came up with? Then what's the next phase? Doing some research in terms of, okay, have you read everything that's out there in terms of research for reading for pleasure? What other programs exist out there that's really going to work for us? I'm not saying that English Mastery or others, you know, we're a silver bullet, but it is something that we can support with. And if it is a key strategy that you're thinking of looking at, perhaps this summer or next academic term. So do get in touch if you're interested.
Well, thanks very much, Michlyn, for
No worries.
pearls of wisdom. And thank you everyone for attending. Hope that it was useful. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons and evenings.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.